change your nameplate so that we know who you are in the session. Thank you. Before we start and introduce our honored guests, I want to do a little bit of work and sharing here in terms of where we are in the process and where we are headed. And also want to take the opportunity to call the meeting to order. As you know, we started out this process with Secretary King on February 11th. We then dove into some data and addressed some cost routes, and now we're in the process of developing some thoughts engaged with the research and practice to develop recommendations. Each meeting at this point will follow by a set of recommendations based on the previous meetings discussions. I also want to note that we do have a change in schedule, as is often the case, and we will be keeping you abreast of what those changes are. And I also want to note that we added one more meeting to the process for the 23rd of March as a backup, so that we have more opportunity to directly engage with the recommendations as we develop them. Superintendent Arenakis will go over what those are and what the process will be for input, but wanted to make you very much so aware of that upfront. This is our agenda for this morning. We have quite the honored guests with us who are experts in their field. We're going to start out with Dr. Brackett in social and emotional learning, Dr. Marva Gordato for multilingual learners, and then Dr. Jones, differently able students. But before we do that, I would like to pass on and introduce our Commissioner of Education, Angelica Infante Green.
Good morning, everyone. I was commenting on the music earlier on because if you know the words, we've made the sunshine, right? And I think that's where we are right now, right? In this place where there's a lot of hope, there's a lot of work, there's a lot of unity amongst us as we do this work. So I feel very hopeful. At first I was like, oh, it's kind of somber, but then I started listening to it. I was like, all right, we should all sing in unison, because that's where we are. We feel like we're in a good place. So, but I want to take this moment to thank each and every one of you for coming every week, for your commitment to the work and the children of Rhode Island. I also want to acknowledge our colleagues in state government and our community partners that have really dedicated their time to really being a part of this process. Today, we're going to hear a little bit about the conversations we had last week and the topics, and today you're going to hear about topics that I am particularly passionate about and that we really need to work hard in our state. So you're going to hear about our multilingual learners that in all cases are at single digits in every single district. So this is an area that we need to really focus in on. As we start moving forward, there really can't be a plan without having a focus on this population. Then we're going to talk about our differently abled students, another area that we really need to focus a lot of our energy. And it's really important for us. But to set the stage, we know that the social emotional supports for students and teachers are more critical today than they have ever been. And to have that conversation with us today, we have Dr. Brackett here to share the work that he's doing at Yale, some of his partnership through our unique social emotional learning course that we've made available to all Rhode Island educators. And Dr. Brackett, I am so grateful personally to you because we reached out and he said, yes, I'm in. And we like that here in Rhode Island. We want people that are in, especially with our neighboring. When we heard that Connecticut was doing this, we were like, no, we have to do it too, and we have to do it better. So sorry about that, but that's where we are. We're going to do it. But I think at the end of the day, our kids and our teachers, everybody needs to understand how to really intertwine our social emotional work as we move forward. Then we have Dr. Madeline Mavrocordato, who is going to talk to us about our multilingual learners. And Dr. Madeline, one of the things that's really important for us, and I come from New York, we did not call our kids LEP as the government did because there's nothing limited about our population. And we don't call them ELLs. You know, they were kind of trying to catch up to us because it's not just about learning English. It's about being multilingual and about bringing the strengths forward. And that's the work that we need to do in order to propel our students as we move forward. And lastly, but certainly we will not lastly, but Dr. Jones, I hope I'm saying your name correctly, from Boston University, work around differently abled students. And we know that that's an area that we all need to get better at. And our students have really been impacted very differently than other students because of the different needs that we have. And we have to look at their strengths and how do we really provide for our students in a very different way. So our conversations are not just about what's happened in COVID, but really how do we go back to where we were was not a great place, right? So we want to really use this opportunity to propel our kids forward. So I hope that that's where we all are, because that's where I am, and that's where we will be moving forward and working together and united here in the state of Rhode Island. So with that, I'd like to introduce you to our Deputy Commissioner, Anna Riley, and our Superintendent, I have to say it, of the year, because you only get to be it 1 year. Jim Aronakis from Exeter West Greenwich. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner, and good morning to everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Before we move into today's work, I want to take a moment to review the ways that you can all communicate with us, with the LEAP Task Force. For those of you following along, please include the hashtag LEAPRI and share your experiences. Share RIDE's posts on social media, or reach out to us via our email, which is leaptaskforce@ride.ri.gov. Again, that's leaptaskforce@ride.ri.gov. As a reminder, we have a very ambitious schedule before us, and I want you all to understand the work that still is ahead of us. This is a timeline that we've shared at each of our meetings. We are grounded in 4 core categories that we've heard to date, and those are achievement, meaning the academic success of our students, attendance, acknowledging the engagement impact of students when they are present, the social emotional needs of our school community, and above all, we've rooted ourselves in equity in education. This is why this work matters. We've started at the problem of practice and laid out a clear path forward for members to get us to our ultimate goal of a final report. And at this point, I'd like to just go through our problem of practice and remind us all of our charge. How can RIDE and all of us as stakeholders come together prior to reentry in 2021, the fall of 21, to ensure both academic and social emotional readiness for all of our students? And how do we provide accelerated learning opportunities for students who have been underserved for decades? As a task force, our job is to identify the key steps to mitigate both academic and social emotional impacts of COVID, how we can use the next 3 summers to provide additional opportunities for targeted accelerated learning, and how we leverage the next 2 school years to continue to both mitigate and accelerate learning for kids who need it. As we shift to the recommendations phase of the work, it is important to review our theory of action as well. Note the focus on collaboration, partnerships, the strategic investment in resources and high leverage activities, and all of this is to address and accelerate learning and meaningfully support both students, families, and our educators as well. We believe that RIDE and the local education agencies and our community partners and the support of our community are in the best place to support this work as we move forward. As you know, At the end of this process, we will be delivering a report with some very high-level recommendations to help guide Rhode Island's path to learning acceleration. And so if we could look at the recommendations at this point. I want to take a look at the draft recommendations we heard in our breakout rooms and questions and answers from last week from the group, combined with the research that we've had a chance to listen to and kind of digest. First, I want us to think about the conversation we had about extended learning last week. We heard that extended learning opportunities should begin from the place of providing a safe and supportive environment for students with supportive adults, diverse students and staff that reflect the students they are serving, and programs that complement classroom standards. We also know that all extended learning opportunities should begin with the equity principle of targeting the students who need these opportunities the most, including our differently abled students, our multilingual learners, students of color, and those who have limited or no access to in-person learning. Moving on to our summer opportunities, we know that whenever possible, options for summer programming should be provided to families and students in person and be delivered in a way that leans on existing partners. We know that we should provide small classes with fewer than 15 students for at least 5 to 6 weeks and focused both on attendance and engagement, meaningful engagement, among other positive supports. And lastly, I want to acknowledge the critical role tutoring will play. Tutoring is both a viable activity for expanded learning during the summer, but also something that we should be looking at in terms of reentry in the fall of 2021. It should be a part of our plan as well. This is not an either or, but should be approached as an and both. We also need to be thinking about how our work ahead can lead to systemic long-term change, not just work that we're doing in the summer and then we're good to go. How do we bring this work to a level where we're implementing high leverage strategies for long-term growth and change? So I want to give you a moment to review what we have heard and seen so far.
Jim, I'm going to jump in a little bit.
Yes.
I think one of the things that resonated with me the most last week that we heard was having a consistent tutor, having it not just be a summer activity, but also happening throughout the school year, that there'd be a connection between the tutors and the school, because we sort of, there's like a handoff, but there is no real connection and sharing of where the student is, so that this is not just an add-on, but part of what needs to happen throughout the school year.
Exactly. So I want to remind us how we plan to move forward. The sessions and the content that are presented in these meetings are designed to help us focus and be strategic about our approach. Our open conversations have been an opportunity to digest the content presented to us that day. And RIDE staff continue to capture those conversations to draft recommendations for this group's feedback. Beyond our weekly meetings, we have established a feedback session, a weekly feedback session. And as a reminder, you can always reach out via the LEAP email. I wanted to go through some questions for you to keep in mind as we continue to move through our presentations. What strategies shared today stood out to you as particularly promising for supporting multilingual learners, differently abled students, and social emotional learning in Rhode Island? What challenges and systemic barriers are most critical to address in our efforts to create equitable learning opportunities for these students? And what suggestions do you have for strengthening learning for diverse populations in Rhode Island? This will help guide our conversations after we hear the presentations today. As we hear from our presenters, it's important to think through the types of opportunities we want to provide our students and schools this year and beyond. And with that in mind, I would like to introduce Dr. Mark Brackett from Yale for our first presentation of the day. Dr. Brackett.
Yay!
Good morning, everybody. I have to say, this is like the most cheerful morning presentation group I've ever been with. We're cheering each other. This is cool. So thank you very much for inviting me. And as some of you know, we have had a collaboration already with launching a course that we built during COVID to support teachers and students. It's called Managing Emotions During Uncertain and Stressful Times. And I just looked up the data. We have about 1,000 enrolled educators in that course already. And about 20% of them have already completed it. And we just launched a couple of weeks ago. It's a 10-week course. And I'm proud to say that the ratings so far are 5.0 out of 5.0. So people are really benefiting from it and enjoying it. And with that said, given I'm a professor, I'm going to show my PowerPoint slide. So I titled my presentation today, and as my fellow academics who are also presenting know, like 10 minutes is like, that is not fair, just to put it out there. But I'm going to do my best. Social and emotional learning during a pandemic, from theory to practice to systemic change. And I'm going to just start with a settling quote, one that comforts me all the time. It makes me think differently. As you grow older, you will discover that you have two hands, one for helping yourself and the other for helping others. And so oftentimes when we think about social and emotional learning, we think about doing something to kids. And I want to try to shift our mindset around that, which is that we are doing something for the entire system to support everyone's health and growth. And I'm going to just share some data with you. So we've had the opportunity over the last 9 months or so to do very large scale studies. This one is on students. This is mostly elementary and middle school students. And what we found among them is that the number one emotion is frustrated. Kids are just sitting with frustration. They're also feeling bored and anxious and sad and angry. There's some happiness, but for the majority of our children right now, they're experiencing what we'd say more unpleasant than pleasant emotions. Among educators, I think we have the largest data set now. We have 30,000 teachers in this study across the United States from every kind of school district you can imagine. The number one emotion among teachers is anxiety. Now, we did an initial study right when COVID hit at the end of March. Anxious was the number one word. At the end of June, we did another study. Anxious was the number one word. We did another study in the fall. The number one word, anxious. Now, it's interesting. When we ask teachers how they want to feel, it's not anxious, overwhelmed, scared. It's, I want to feel valued. I want to feel supported. The number one word right now is I want to feel appreciated, which I think is something to just keep in mind. We did a study with 1,000 principals across the United States. They don't look any different from our classroom educators. Anxiety is the number one word. So when we think about the general feelings, and then we layer that on top of COVID, and we look at other data around families, 67% increase in parents who are reporting feeling anxious and depressed, a 42% increase in children's externalizing behaviors. Compared to 2018, this year, adults are 8 times more likely to report serious mental distress. And when we look in our communities of color, in areas where our Black and Brown children and teachers are working and going to school, we see higher chances of contracting the coronavirus. We see greater needs. We see less access to quality healthcare, and we even see greater mortality rates. And I bring this up primarily, well, first, it's an injustice, but secondly, is that when we think about social and emotional learning, it's not about a child. I want to just reiterate, it's not about this child needs skills to get out of their circumstances. I think that mindset can be it's very disturbing to me personally. I think it's about what are the systems that need to be in place to support all children so that we have greater equity. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. going back to this, we call this the mood meter. Many of you know this as one of our tools. You can see we're pretty out of balance. We've got a lot of red and blue in our nation, and we've got, not so much of that yellow and green. And I think one of the misguided principles is that everybody thinks we're supposed to be in the yellow. I can't tell you how many teachers say, like, what are you gonna do to be happy today? I'm like, happy? Like, I'm just begging for like contentment. These are really difficult times. So like, if you always tell me I have to be happy, I don't know, that doesn't feel right. And this brings me to the vision of our work, which is to use the power of emotions to create a healthier and more equitable, innovative, and compassionate society. In my work, I talk about this concept, permission to feel. It's the title of a book I wrote. And what I did was research with tens of thousands of people about this concept. What does it mean to give yourself and everyone that you love, and even the people you don't love so much, that permission? And what you can see here are some pretty interesting words: compassionate, empathic, non-judgmental, supportive, validating. So I'm going to ask everyone on this webinar today, how about applying these principles to yourself during the last 10 months? Have you been self-compassionate? Have you given yourself unconditional love? Have you been empathic to yourself, non-judgmental about how you've been feeling, supportive to yourself? Have you validated yourself? How about with other people? And it's interesting, when I share those, what I would call vulnerable aspects of the work, people oftentimes get uncomfortable. They say, well, what's the data show? And so this is my my data slide. And of course, I could speak for hours and days about this, but what we know from our research and what everyone should know about children is that emotions matter for 5 really big reasons: attention, memory, and learning. So what we know is that children have more difficulty focusing when they're feeling chronic stress and toxic stress. It's biological. We know that it influences our decision-making, the quality of our relationships, clearly our mental and physical health, and performance and creativity. What we find in our research is that even, well, to put this slightly or simply, that our cognitive abilities are critically important. No one's going to argue that. But what we find oftentimes is that children's feelings about school, children's feelings in the classroom, their abilities to manage those feelings are what provide that added support. So, for example, in school, you're going to get difficult feedback. You are going to be disappointed in your progress towards a goal. You're going to get frustrated. You're going to get overwhelmed. And if you don't have the strategies to manage it, oftentimes you don't achieve your goals. That leads to the skills. And again, I could spend months talking about these skills, but for now, we're just going to use the acronym RULER, which is the term we use to describe the 5 skills of emotional intelligence. It's about being self-aware and aware of others' emotions, knowing what causes feelings. So quickly, I asked about 250 superintendents at AASA a couple of weeks ago, what's the difference between anxiety, stress, fear, and overwhelm? Anyone want to guess what the #1 response was? Nothing. I was like, that's not a trick question. And so many of our leaders don't really understand the differences. And why is that important? Well, think about it. Overwhelm is when you just have too much on your plate. Anxiety, uncertainty about the future. Stress, too many demands, not enough resources. And so I share that with you because being able to label our feelings accurately is a guide to helping us express our emotions in a healthy way, and also finding the strategies that work best to regulate them. I think relevant to the work that Rhode Island is doing, I want to just mention one thing about emotion regulation. First, it's very specific to the feeling. For example, managing anger is very different than managing anxiety or stress, or generating feelings of contentment or elation. It's specific to the person. There's no correctness here. It's not that, I'm a neurotic, gay, Jewish professor, just to put it out there. And so my strategies might be different than some people's strategies here. And I don't want to be judged for using my strategies, and I don't want to judge you for using yours. I want to help each other learn the strategies that work best for each of us to achieve our goals and well-being. It's specific to the situation and relationship. We know that context matters. We can see children in one classroom, they're doing really well in terms of managing their feelings, and another one, they're not doing well. So what about the context that's influencing their emotion regulation ability? We often have to unlearn the bad habits. I learned some of those from my family. Remember, it's not about control. It's about using emotions wisely. We have to really become scientists around strategies, checking in with ourselves. Is this working for me? Is it working against me? And lastly, I just want to reiterate, there's no criterion of correctness, which makes this work harder oftentimes than traditional academic work, because we look for correctness in math and science, but with emotion management, it's about evaluating what's working best for me in my context for my health and wellness. So last few minutes, Ruler is the approach that we built at the Center for Emotional Intelligence. We're trying to help districts. Right now in Connecticut, we're working with 250 schools across the state, 3,000 across the United States, move from a piecemeal approach to a more systemic approach. And just very briefly, starts with adults, then students, pre-K all the way to high school, families, and OST time. These are some of the tools. We call the charter to build a positive emotional climate, excuse me. So asking our educators and our students, well, how do you want to feel? Not the rules, but how do you want to feel in this classroom, in this school? And what do we need to do in order to have those feelings more frequently? The mood meter is helping our children build self-awareness. I love this one. This is a preschool where they made mood meter gifts for their families. And they go home and the kids themselves teach their parents this tool so they have the common language. The meta moment is our tool for healthy emotion regulation, oftentimes thinking about our best selves. And then finally, the blueprint is one of our tools for perspective taking, interpersonal problem solving, and restorative practices. So we know from our randomized controlled trials that this work makes a difference in kids' lives and teachers' lives. We have 2 large experiments going on right now across the United States. I just want to make the comparison to Connecticut. Commissioner, I'm sorry to pin you or against Connecticut, but I just think it's important to show this took many years for us to accomplish, but we've got all the systems from the teachers unions to the Department of Education to the Superintendents Association to legislators all working together to support us in thinking critically about healthy teacher and student emotional development. Lastly, I just want to share the course that I mentioned earlier that's available for free for every educator in Rhode Island. And thanks to a grant, every teacher who goes through the course or staff member gets a certificate from Yale and upon completion. And my last slide, I hope I did pretty good. Let me just ask us to take a little deep breath potentially. I know I feel like I'm like super speed forward. So I need a little breath to help me come back to the present moment. So as we think about this work together, from commissioners to state representatives to policymakers, I ask you, can you A, give yourself and everyone that you work with and that permission to feel all emotions? There's no good or bad emotions. Emotions are experiences. All of them are legitimate. Can we strive to be those emotion scientists, those critical, curious explorers, as opposed to the closed judges? Remember that these skills are about using all emotions wisely. I just say we have to appreciate that this is oftentimes harder than what we call hard skills. I don't even like to use the term soft skills because I think it's demeaning to a major part of who we are, but nevertheless, people have classified emotional intelligence and SEL as soft skills. I think we need to show that they're life skills, not soft skills. I urge all of us to think like preventionists and interventionists. Remember that if we continue to do interventions, the number of new cases that come in doesn't decrease. And so what we want to do is think prevention focusedly in terms of ensuring our preschoolers, elementary schoolers, middle schoolers, high schoolers are developing these skills across their experiences. Probably we need greater balance. I think oftentimes SEL is thrown into the system as opposed to integrated into it. I think one thing I've seen for the last 25 years is the quick fix mentality. You know, we're going to do mindfulness. No, it's bullying prevention. No, it's equity. No, it's this. No, it's this. No, it's this. And we're not really thinking systemically with an equity lens in terms of how all these things fit together and how teachers can be trained and how leaders can be supporting this continuous development. And lastly, I'll just say, as someone who was a failing student, as someone who was terribly bullied as a kid and hated school, I was blessed to have an uncle who was a teacher, who was my hero. and his name was Uncle Marvin. And he did one thing that my parents didn't know how to do. He asked me how I was feeling. And he also didn't tell me what to do about it. What he did was he was that curious explorer of helping me discover, with his support, the strategy that would work best for me so that I could have well-being, so that I could build and maintain positive relationships, so that I could make sound decision-making. So I'm going to urge us all to not give up in terms of building a healthier and more equitable, innovative, compassionate society. And on that note, thank you. And I look forward to a discussion later on, hearing from our other colleagues.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brackett. Now we are going to hear about some high leverage strategies for Rhode Island's multilingual learners. And the presenter is Dr. Madeline Mavrogardato from Michigan State University. Dr. Madeline?
Hi, everyone. It's so nice to be here with you all today. Muchísimas gracias por la invitación. I'm here today to talk with you a little bit specifically about some strategies regarding your multilingual learners. And I don't think I have to make a sales pitch to this particular group about why it is absolutely critical to focus on this particular group of students in the state of Rhode Island and nationwide for that matter. But I really want to spend my time today focusing on some big ideas, surfacing some ideas that you may or may not have heard of, that may give you some concrete ways of moving forward in terms of strategies you want to perhaps consider adopting or consider spending some of the funding money that is coming in to use. So I wanted just to start very briefly by just sharing this idea that we know that multilingual learners and their families have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. And we know that the academic impact of COVID-19 has been particularly pronounced for multilingual learners. So I know you all had a presentation a couple weeks ago, or maybe it was a month ago, that looked at some of the academic data that has come out and has looked at sort of the expansion of some of the gaps. These are long-standing educational inequities, but I think one could argue that they certainly have been exacerbated by this situation. And as Mark just mentioned a second ago, I think we know that multilingual learners and their families have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic in terms of virus rates, so on and so forth. There was a recent study that came out that it really took my breath away in terms of looking at life expectancy and how life expectancy among different racial and ethnic groups in our country has changed as a result of the pandemic. And the Latino population, their life expectancy is expected to decline by over 3 years as a result of the pandemic. White families, their life expectancy, white people, is expected to decline by about 0.68 years. I mean, that was just striking to me in terms of, these inequities. So it's not just about learning issues. These are about real life family issues that our kids are facing. I know also you guys heard recently that you've talked a lot about absences and absence rates in the state of Rhode Island have increased by 46%. Over the last school year, and multilingual learners were absent more often than non-multilingual learners. So we're going to talk about a couple of strategies specifically to think about with that population today. Okay, so I'm going to put 4 ideas in front of you. So I just want to give you sort of an overarching overview here. We're going to talk about optimizing student attendance. We're going to think a little bit about maximizing student learning, both with regard to time spent on learning and how we are grouping students when we are asking them to learn. We're going to talk about families, linguistic and cultural resources and how to better draw upon those. And we're also going to talk a little bit about educator collaboration. So first off, this idea of optimizing attendance. So one of the things that we know from the research literature that's very clear is that carefully monitoring student attendance and targeted outreach efforts can very much help improve attendance for all students. But what the research shows us is that this combination is particularly potent for multilingual learners. So in a recent randomized field experiment, there were mailers that were sent home. And when I say mailers, I don't mean email, I mean literally snail mail, put them in the US Postal Service mailbox mailers to get them out, that emphasize the connection between good attendance and specific grade-based learning outcomes. And these were sent to the parents of high absence students. And what they found in this randomized field experiment was that this increased attendance by about 8% across all students, but that the treatment effect was nearly double for multilingual learners compared to native English speakers. So this is just sort of interesting, right? That an intervention like this has a differential impact for this particular group of students. And so let me show you a little bit more what this looked like. So this is an example of one of these mailers that was sent home. And what's interesting about this, you'll notice that in these mailers, there is a statement that ties absence or missing school to some type of outcome that is relevant to that child's grade level where they are. And you will also notice that it indicates the specific number of days that the child has been absent. And what they found is that, when they did focus groups, it's interesting that parents often indicate that they perceive the consequence of being absent to being singular or short term. They have a hard time understanding that absences are cumulative and that they have long-term effects. And so the idea with this statement, this did you know statement, is to help parents make the connection between absences adding up to having these longer term, bigger impacts. And then also they have found, and the research shows us, that parents of high absence students often underestimate the number of school days that their child has actually missed. And so they also try to address this in these mailers by being very clear. How many specific days has the child missed school? And so they do that in these mailers. And what they did was they sent these mailers home 6 times during the course of the year. And they targeted students who had high absence rates the previous year, right? So we could look at students who have been highly absent this academic year, and move forward next year with an intervention along these lines. And you can see that the messaging changed a little bit with each mailer that they sent. And all of these messages were tied to linking attendance to these longer term outcomes to help parents see that connection. And I will just mention too, the key here for multilingual learners is that the mailers were sent in students' native language, right? So they were translated appropriately. And the total cost of this intervention per student was under $6, okay? And so I just want to mention this because a lot of times we look at programs like mentoring can have an impact of reducing absence rates, so on and so forth. But and mentoring is extremely important and valuable for any number of reasons. But if we are trying to target absences and absenteeism specifically, this is actually a very low cost strategy that has been shown to have concrete impacts, particularly for multilingual learners. I want to turn to this idea of time, how we're spending time with kids, and grouping strategies for students. So one of the things that we know, and you guys have heard about this, I think you heard about this in your last session, extended learning time outside of regular school hours or during the summer is particularly helpful to multilingual learners. I appreciated the commissioner's comment that this isn't just an add-on, it needs to be integrated into the day-to-day of what we do in terms of tutoring and extending learning time. And just as an example, the Center City Public Charter Schools use Title III funds to operate ESL After the Bell, which was, it is a 2-hour after-school program designed to meet the needs of K-8 multilingual learner students and their academic support needs. And this is their model, right? Their ESL After the Bell model. And what you'll notice about this particular model is this isn't just sort of we get kids together and house them for 2 hours after school, right? This is intentional and purposeful. So what this model did, they aligned to the Common Core state standards and to WIDA standards in terms of what they are doing with students during the 2-hour block after school. Interestingly, it's both ESL teachers as well as general education teachers that work together in this work together after school. which is absolutely critical to bring together these academic standards with the WIDA English language development standards. And then I think the other part that's really important here is that this is based in project-based learning. And one of the things that we know is that having multilingual learner students confront a real world problem that requires authentic solutions can facilitate meaningful academic language development, right? So this isn't just, we're going to teach you some vocabulary words. This is about learning and acquiring academic vocabulary and fluency and literacy to address a real world problem. I want to talk very briefly about the idea of grouping strategies. So one of the other things that we know that's very important for multilingual learner students are small groups and working one-on-one with teachers. Again, if you sort of spend money on small groups or working one-on-one with teachers, your return on investment for multilingual learners is greater because the impacts are greater for this group of students than for other groups of students. And so I want to just talk briefly about how you can use small groups for multilingual learners. One is you want to make sure that you're using this precious assessment data, right? That I know Rhode Island is going out and getting. I know WIDA is well underway in Rhode Island. And we want the key with this assessment data is we have to be using it. It's very valuable data. And so if we use it to then group students, this can be extremely helpful in thinking about how we construct purposefully and intentionally small groups for multilingual learners. So one of the things that's very interesting is that the research shows us that if we are concerned about foundational literacy skills, so things like decoding and fluent reading, it actually makes sense to group students in homogeneous groups, right? So we want like students who need to build foundational literacy skills to be grouped together. But interestingly, with multilingual learners, when we're interested in helping them build comprehension, oral and written language, we actually want diverse groups of students who are at different levels to be grouped together. So again, it's sort of like what we know, we can make these small groups, the time that we're investing, much more valuable, right? And so thinking purposefully and intentionally about how you put your small groups together is really important. Valuing cultural and linguistic assets of our multilingual learners is absolutely essential. And there are ways that we can better engage families meaningfully to promote academic success. And so I think one of the best things that we can do is encourage families to draw upon their native languages as they work with their students. And so often we hear families, I'm a former bilingual teacher from South Texas on the Mexican border, and I also taught in Northern California. And one of the narratives that I heard over and over again, and I still do to this day from families is, you know, I don't really know how to help my child because my English, right? My English isn't there, or I'm not the best of readers, right? And so one of the things that we need to reaffirm with our families over and over again is it doesn't matter what language you're helping your child in, help your child in whatever language you feel most comfortable in. Because guess what? If you are helping your child read in Espanol, those skills that you're helping your child build are going to translate and transfer into English, right? So just as an example, I want you guys to see this, and I encourage you guys to look up this resource. This is sort of a little known resource that is unbelievable, and it is free. Okay, so it's called the Red Bilingüe Mex US. It's actually a partnership with the Mexican government. Okay, and this is an incredible set of resources and texts in Spanish that are totally free. And these are not English resources that some person translated into Spanish. These were generated in Mexico, right? And backed by the Mexican government. And they have literally graded readers. They have all sorts of texts, videos that are totally free. And this is an excellent resource for our families to be using as they work with their children to read at home, or just to learn more about their own cultures and backgrounds, particularly if they are of Mexican origin. And then I just want to mention one other strategy to highlight. One of the silver linings that has come out of this pandemic, and I think there are actually a few, right? And we have to hold on to these and elevate them. One of the things that I am hearing over and over and over again as I give talks is that there are better connections between general education teachers and multilingual learner focused teachers now than there have been ever before, because these folks have had to collaborate to serve students in virtual settings, and they're talking and they're working together. And as we transition back to face-to-face, a lot of educators are concerned that these collaborative and co-teaching arrangements are going to just dwindle and go away, and we're going to return to what we were doing before. And so what I would encourage you to think about is if there are ways in your state or in districts across your state to encourage leaders to invest in specific co-planning time and set co-teaching expectations between multilingual learner-focused teachers and gen ed teachers. That could mean paying people an extra half hour or hour after school once a week, every other week, to get together to do that time, to invest that time. And this is very much an appropriate use of Title III dollars and funding that would come out of the federal resources that we have available to us. So I think I'm going to pause there because I want to make sure that I'm on time, but this is just a summary of the ideas that I have said, and I'd really like to engage with you guys and hear your questions as we continue through the session today. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much. That was very insightful. We are going to move on to our third presentation before we have a chance to discuss and ask additional questions. We are at this point are welcoming Dr. Nathan Jones, and Dr. Jones will talk about how our schools can intervene to support differently abled students. Dr. Jones?
Thank you so much, and I appreciate you all inviting me and the other presenters to speak to you this morning. In some ways, the first two presentations make my job a little easier because I think they've highlighted some strategies that are actually really beneficial for differently abled students as well. And as Mark was speaking about his Uncle Marvin, I went to Ancestry.com to make sure that we were not related, because I also had Uncle Marvin who was a psychologist by training and played an important role in my youth. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen to get started. Okay. So I was charged with speaking about how schools can be supporting differently abled students in response to COVID-19, or as we think about moving into fall of 2021. I think this is a population of students that is it's a critical subpopulation in school districts. That part is pretty hard to deny. And it's also a group of students that have legal protections. And I know at the district level and I know at state levels, that carries with it a large number of consequences for how we think about planning and supporting these students moving forward. So, you know, I live in Massachusetts and I've spent a lot of time thinking about Massachusetts schooling. I don't think the story I'm telling here is one that's specific to students with disabilities, nor is it one that's specific to our state. But what I will say is that I think from this vantage point, one of the things that we've seen is most everybody to a person is working hard, right? So going back to Mark's point around anxiety and frustration, the kind of the collective exhaustion, I think, is being felt. And I think it's important to attend to, in particularly, the experience of families at this time, particularly for students with disabilities. I think many families have had to take on additional responsibilities in their daily lives that, and so I think they're really looking for schools to support them and provide answers. I think one of the things that we've also seen, at least, and I'll give the example of Massachusetts. So in Massachusetts, where we are now versus where we were a year ago, is that many more students are getting access to the services that are legally mandated for them. But with that additional provision of services has come a lack of satisfaction with the quality of those services. And this is not to place blame on schools. Instead, this is just to suggest that we are all collectively trying to build this ship as we are flying it. And I think we really do have these issues of we are building back infrastructure, and in doing so, we need to really attend to the quality of that infrastructure as well. I also think, to Maddie's point, students with disabilities or differently abled students are a group that, like English learners or multilingual learners, are folks who I think we have seen in emerging data are at particular risk, particularly around beginning skills in reading, mathematics, and writing. And so as I talk about some strategies here today, I think I'm going to focus specifically on those academic needs, recognizing that there's also behavioral needs that are critically important. But I think for the sake of brevity, I'm going to focus on the academic example largely. So the one thing I want to flag to start is a resource that I put together with two of my colleagues, Sharon Vaughn and Lynn Fuchs. This was organized by Nate Schwartz and the folks at the Annenberg Center at Brown, as well as Results for America, as part of their Ed Research for Recovery series. We were charged with putting together a brief on supporting differently abled students. And there's not a large evidence base for supporting students in the wake of a global pandemic. But what we did do was look back to evidence that's been accrued in special education research over the last 20, 30 years. And we've done our best to try to summarize what schools can do moving forward. And I think to the commissioner's point, we didn't have it perfect before. And so I think as we think about moving forward, one of the tasks is how can we leverage this moment to try to develop new systems that really are going to be maximally beneficial for our differently abled students. So I have really just 3 recommendations, and these aren't breaking. I mean, this is not groundbreaking by any stretch of the imagination. And if anything, these are the messages that special educators have been pushing for years and promoting for years, but I think they become incredibly important during this time because the line is truly being blurred between students that are differently abled as well as students who have additional needs in the academic areas at this time. So I'm going to talk about these 3. So using universal screening, prioritizing targeted individualized intervention, coupled with routine progress monitoring, and then deploying available personnel to meet those 2 goals. So I know that there are limits on what we can do to reorganize personnel in schools, but I think this is one where we need to work collectively, I think at the state level, but also within districts to see how can we kind of shift personnel to most beneficially meet the needs of differently abled students. The one thing that I always like to impress is this quote that I think is, it kind of drives how I think about the role of special educators and the work in front of us, is that there's this, I think, this idea that we need patient teachers for differently abled students. And I think this Heward article from 2003 really points out that we actually have to do more with less. And by when I say more, I think what I mean is that students benefit from an intensification of instruction and basically making progress with less time to do so. And so I think that kind of drives the way that I think about this work. So to begin with universal screening, I want to start by saying that I think this last year has likely increased risk for all students. And state standardized testing is going to give us some information, but not nearly enough information that we might need to drive and target instruction for students in core academic areas. And so I think one of the recommendations we've seen in the literature is using some sort of universal screening, using standardized assessment tools. The National Center for Intensive Intervention has a beautiful toolkit complete with many different tools that could be used for universal screening. The idea is to do some sort of universal screening as early in the school year as possible with all students to target potential intervention. And I think the important thing to note here is that it could be the case that there's going to be many students who show initial difficulties, but we don't want to over-intervene. We don't want to just identify all students who could benefit from intervention because there's many students who are going to bounce back with typical tier 1 instruction. So if that instruction is high quality, we've got some kids who are going to make progress without needing additional intervention. We've got others who are going to need intervention. So I want to talk about those groups, those students next. So when we think about selecting interventions, we need to be focusing on students' individual needs. And there are some basic core dimensions of typical interventions. They typically ask an instructor to provide explicit systematic instruction, whether it's academic skills or behavioral skills. The core ingredients tend to look the same. The other thing that I should note in terms of what do we know about how intervention should be delivered? Typically, most students need intervention 3 to 5 times per week. This can occur in small group. This can occur one-on-one. The intensity of that intervention time depends on students' individual needs, and it depends on what we see in the data. So to just do intervention for intervention's sake is probably a really inefficient way to move forward. And so to really benefit students, we need to couple that intervention time with weekly progress monitoring. Now, this could be difficult to be thinking about doing at a school-wide or district-wide scale. There's some evidence that we can do progress monitoring as rarely as once every 3 weeks. But the importance here is really focusing on using validated tools that have been established in the literature. They are out there. Many of them are free. Many of them take very little time to administer in the context of the normal school day. But what they yield and what they provide is incredibly beneficial to our differently abled students. I think the other thing that I want to flag before moving on is that we should not think about this intervention time as needing to occur in special education alone, nor should we think of it being specifically beneficial for differently abled students. I think one thing we recognize, and I think is kind of one thing we should kind of lean into here, is that special ed has been doing this kind of work for years. And I think we are facing a situation where many more students might benefit from some form of intervention. And so there's lessons that can be learned from the work that has already been done. The one thing that I added the slide during the other presentations, because I think it's important to note, is that I am sensitive to us coming in and saying, you need to do this extra plus this extra plus this extra for this goal or for this group of students. And as I heard the other two presenters speak, I found myself thinking that there are these points of convergence, and we don't necessarily have to work at cross purposes. So some instructional practices, such as explicit systematic instruction, are beneficial across student subgroups. Now this, for multilingual learners, this is not sufficient in and of itself, but as part of a package of other instructional practices, it can be really beneficial for multiple groups of students. I will also say that there's some promising evidence of interventions that jointly target academic and socio-emotional goals. So there's an ongoing study funded by the NIH where, led by Amy Grills, who's a colleague of mine at BU, and Sharon Vaughn at University of Texas, where they coupled a reading intervention with a daily 5-minute anxiety intervention for students who were struggling with reading and who had anxiety that was specifically tied to reading in classrooms, which we can all imagine why that might be the case. So this is, and they have seen in a large scale RCT that across multiple sites, improvements in both reading comprehension and decreases in anxiety. So I think that there are ways that we could be thinking about these two things. I will also just note that if folks want materials from this intervention, Amy Grills is also my wife, and so I can very easily get you those things, but it's really, really exciting and kind of cutting edge work that I think I want to flag. So finally, I just want to point out that I do think we have to think about the resources we have in schools. And so I think we have to acknowledge the kind of the preciousness of the time that special educators have. I think we often are asking them to do their core responsibilities, but then do all additional stuff. And so I think the point that I would just want to flag here is that we really want to think about special educators in service of promoting access to interventions. And if this can be done in inclusive settings, great. But I think we can't I've said we can't differentiate our way out of this, right? And what I mean by that is our differently abled students are going to need more instruction and intensified instruction in academic areas. I think the last point the two other points, and then I will be finished, I promise. One is that, I think one thing that some districts in Rhode Island have explored is the use of paraprofessionals or tutors to deliver interventions. I think this is something that there can be support for with some conditions. So I think the key condition is that this kind of intervention delivered by parapros has to be supervised. It does not mean the special educator is standing above or outside and watching in the same classroom, but it just means that the paraprofessional is being supported and trained to deliver interventions. So that could be one way to ease the personnel strain that we might experience based on a recommendation like this. I think the other thing I want to note is that collaboration is essential. And I think we have to look at the work being done by our general educators to support students' foundational skills. So just to summarize, I would argue that during this time, we really need to be focused on a lot of things, but one of the key ones is teaching and learning. And I think interventions are a really powerful tool, and we need to center our instruction on the delivery of those for kids with disabilities, or sorry, differently abled students. My apologies. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. All right, let me pull up my slides here. While I'm doing that, I saw it in the chat, but I'm going to take this opportunity to publicly thank Dr. Schwartz and the Annenberg Institute, who made Dr. Mavrocordato and Dr. Jones available to us through their ed recovery work. So thank you. We truly appreciate it. And all the support from the Annenberg Institute that we have going on in partnership at RIDE. Let me see here. I've got there we go. Okay, so some guidelines for our discussion, folks. As quick reminders, muted when you're not speaking. We have 3 great topics today. So we have 3 amazing speakers you can direct your questions to. Focused on the initiatives, active listening, and then honors the equity of voice. We are going to do, Josh is going to again moderate for us with some hand raising, but I'll also be checking the chat, and we'll try to intersperse some of those chat questions there. Let's see, just a reminder of those guiding questions that Jim shared earlier. All right, and I want to jump right into our Q&A so we can get as much time together with our esteemed panelists as possible. So Josh, I'm going to pass it over for you for questions.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you to all of you for having me back here and the opportunity to facilitate our Q&A. So as Anna said, she'll be elevating the chat questions, and I will be calling on folks who have their hand raised. So I will jump right in and say anyone who wants to raise their hand, go ahead, and I will call on you in the order in which your hand was raised.
Good morning, this is KHR Bradford from Providence Public School District, and we are really looking at increasing the participation of our MLLs in all of our advanced academics programs. And just wanting to hear from the team, what are some of those strategies that we should really have in place as we are mapping this out as a tool for acceleration and also parent engagement. Thank you.
Hi, Ketra, it's nice to meet you. Thanks for the question. It's a really important issue. Access to advanced coursework, gifted and talented is another example of that, right? I think one of the things that we actually have to really think about when we're looking at and considering multilingual learners, 2 things. One is, to get to advanced coursework, it's a pipeline, right? And so we don't expect kids to show up in 9, 10, 11, 12, and then suddenly drop them into advanced coursework. There's a series of things that have to happen to get them there. And so we have to sort of think, ahead on that front. I actually had the privilege maybe 4 or 5 years ago of coming to Rhode Island and doing some professional development on long-term English learners. And so students who are classified as, and I'm going to use the term English learner, given that that's from a policy perspective, they're classified that way. But these are students who've been classified as English learners for beyond 5 to 7 years, right? And what we know is that students who come into our schools at an early grade and continue through and remain classified as ELs in middle and high school, they do not have outcomes that are aligned with their peers who are reclassified at an earlier age. And so I guess one of the points that I'm making is that I would say early intervention, right? Early support in elementary school, and really embracing this idea of multilingualism in elementary school and valuing across languages is going to be really important to create the pipeline for students to be going into advanced coursework. I think the one other thing I would also advance for the group here, my understanding is that the state of Rhode Island has some bilingual programs, but that this is not sort of an overarching and overwhelming model that we see. And I very much appreciate the use of the multilingual learner terminology, because that is, I think, a much more accurate term than English learner, given what our kids do. However, I would nudge the state a little bit to say, is the state taking a multilingual learner approach, right, in their education? And I say that because, for example, advanced coursework could be bilingual. And that would be one way to open doors to students from multilingual learner backgrounds. And I'm sure the commissioner would love to respond.
Oh yes, I'm definitely going to chime in here. So this is my area, as everybody knows, this is my area of expertise. So two things. So I think your challenge is something that we've already taken on, right? We've created the blueprint for multilingual learner success. We've given out grants for districts to plan to have bilingual programs. We understand the value and the importance, and that's the only way we're going to make real change. So we put out that grant, and we're working with districts to really have a strong model so that they can keep moving forward. So we're on the same page. In terms of the pathway, I don't think it's just a pathway. So there's a lot of work from my previous work. If you put kids in advanced coursework, but you give them the supports, and you give them the home language, our kids will exceed. Most of our multilingual learners, once they are no longer classified as multilingual learners, outperform everyone else. However, that's not what the data in Rhode Island shows, which is an anomaly nationwide. So we have to figure out what we're doing in all our courses to support that home language, so that can be the vehicle to really accelerating what we're doing. And that's what our expectation is in anything that we do. If we're adding time in the day, if we're doing the summer, if we're doing any tutoring, is that there is those home language supports. We know that that's the only way we're going to make the change. So we're on the same page. I'm excited about that.
Thank you for the question, Conchara, and for getting us started. So I see Mr. Bramson has his hand raised, but before I turn it over to you, Andrew, I just want to remind folks of where to find the Raise Your Hand feature. So the Reactions tab at the bottom of your screen, if you click on that, you will then see a bar at the bottom that says Raise Hand. So Andrew, take it away.
Thank you. This is a question for Dr. Mavro-Guardato. So in several communities, we have sort of a double challenge of supporting multilingual learners who also happen to be students that have had disrupted education, and in some cases by several years. I'm a school board member in Central Falls, and this is obviously an issue that we're encountering. I'd love to hear from you about whether this double challenge, does it require a different type of intervention or a similar intervention when it comes to engaging multilingual learners? Thank you.
Thanks for the question. I think it's a both and. So I would say that differentiated specific instruction for students that come in who have had interrupted schooling. So maybe you're talking about refugee groups or students who have had limited formal education experiences. But one of the things that we know is that a lot of times when those students arrive, it can be very helpful to have them together for a brief period of time, 6 months, 1 year, to get their feet under them. The key though, is that that does not become a permanent grouping. We do not want to segregate kids indefinitely. That is not the goal. And so it is a temporary support that is provided for 6 months, 1 year, while students are sort of newcomer. And we work very specifically in small groups targeting basic literacy skills, fluency, sort of what I was talking about with these small groups. Then once they have their feet under them, right, then we want to immediately get them out of sort of this segregated setting and get them back in with the general broader population of multilingual learners and general education students across the board.
Thank you. Oh, go ahead,
Andrew,
Michelle.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to chime in, and I promise I'll keep myself on mute after this. So I did a lot of work with this population in New York, and they tend to outperform everyone if given that opportunity. So there is curriculum that gives you the basics, right? These kids will not take them a year. It'll take them, they're older, they bring background, and you can actually accelerate the learning if you have something very focused for them. And there is New York City has a curriculum. Well, New York State has a curriculum for this population that we're going to try to get our hands on so that we can use it, because it's very quick and it gives them the foundation that they need to then just keep going forward.
Okay, so we will go to Charmaine next with Angelo in the on deck circle.
Good morning, everyone. I just want to say that I'm excited to be here, even though my camera is not working. But unfortunately, this is what you're going to get this morning. My camera's actually on, and that's that. I just want to say, I wanted to speak to just something, maybe it's our wording, but what are we like really leaning towards having a school year as opposed to our school time stopping at a certain point and picking up? I think if we kind of start talking in terms of just extended school year, like our school year starting at one point and continuing, why are we so wrapped on stopping and starting? But we have to start where we are. And possibly we could have teams from our summer learning programs, like not the entire program, but maybe like one person that goes into certain grade levels before the school year is out. So stipend that so people are motivated to do it and to take the extra time and speak with the teachers so that we can kind of get a portfolio on each of the students that can carry over before the school year is over, and so that people can get their programs together for the children that are in their area. And then children are more I want to maybe say incentivize, or it's not a possibility of you stopping. This is just the norm for the school year to continue, and also, again, because, keeping in mind that we might not have stringent attendance policies because children do take off to go visit family members and such, but to kind of keep the school year, like, get out of our zone of saying, we take the summer months off. I think we need to become like education is like continuous and get into that mind frame of however we're doing it, we're even getting our kids out of the idea that education is not bad. It's not something that that we're waiting for the end of the year to get away from. We may be able to take breaks or have it move differently, but where are we with like a year-round school year? Or is that, I don't know, that just came to mind.
So I think that this is the work. We're going to make recommendations, right? I think, but that's really going to be at a district level, right? Do we think that we could have a year round? Absolutely. I don't think we have to keep thinking the way that we have in the past. There's some school districts that go, go to June, take a few weeks off, come back, take a few weeks off. So there's different ways of doing this. What we are talking about is more time, but very, high quality time. So we're not dictating how that happens. We're just recommending that there should be additional time And we can look at all of that. This is, we're not trying to have this top-down approach, but really having the conversations about what our students need.
Thank you, Charmaine. Angelo?
Good morning, everyone, and thanks once again for coming together this morning. So it's interesting because the last 4 or 5 comments that have been made really makes me think a lot about what's on my brain, which is consistency of support along the continuum of a student. So here's a really specific example. In Central Falls, a student can attend a school in kindergarten and get all of these great supports or not, and then go to another school and get all these great supports or not, and then go to the high school and get all of these great supports or not. And so you have a student in the 4 walls of one community where there is a lot of ebb and flow of that. So we either get a student who's been classified, declassify them, get them all set to all these great interventions. I totally stole the ELL after the bell. I wrote it down. We're looking it up as we speak in the background. And then they might just go to a high school where they don't get any of that. They get put back in a smaller classroom where there's no window, like whatever. But I'm asking, how do we ensure that districts who serve our students are on the same page? How do we do that? Because we all know that once there's a bump or a glitch in the screen, we go back to square one. And it's really hard for a school like mine, where we only go up to the 8th grade, to dictate to ascending high school, please make sure you continue all of this great work that we've been doing. Just thinking about that out loud, Madeline.
It's interesting, Angelo, I was just typing a comment in to agree with one of the things that James had just mentioned, where, he said, I can't help but notice that many of the recommendations made today across the presentations are all things that should be happening in highly effective schools. Completely agree, right? And as we move forward, we need to be strategic about how we increase fidelity, right? And I think part of what I hear and what you're saying is like a fidelity issue, right? Like what is happening where, and it should be more consistent and even, right? And I think that if the state is able to pick some specific ideas and strategies to invest in and to build capacity around, then that does help districts make the work more even, right, across their own buildings within their district. And then, it becomes a district issue. Like, what is the supervision looking like in terms of what's happening in individual buildings, right? Districts can make the call whether kids are going to get served in every building or not. And I think it's about holding feet to the fire on that front. I don't actually have a better response than that. I mean, I think this is just incumbent on us to keep like beating the drum, and bearing the cross, whatever idiomatic expression you want to use, right? And just reminding people like, this needs to be consistent. We've invested in this. This is our model. We're moving forward, right? And you guys are clearly on track doing that. And I'll just say, however I can be helpful on the multilingual learner front, please let me know.
I just have one comment to add to that, Angela, which is I think part of what we learned in our work with social emotional learning is that I only cared about kids originally because I was a kid who hated school. I was a failing student. And I said, I got to find a way to help kids like me who were in elementary and middle school succeed. And we failed. And we failed because the educators, with all the best intentions, just didn't have the knowledge and the skills to deliver the intervention. And so we realized, no, it's got to be about teachers and educators and staff. And then we had teachers come to us and say things like, well, my principal told me we can't really start the SEL work until after the state tests. It's like, wait a minute, like that's May. And I'm here in August doing this professional development. What are we doing? And then we realized we have to work with leaders. And then we realized superintendents have to work with school boards and get budgets and have sustainability plans. And so I just urge, thinking systemically around this work as opposed to buying something from a vendor to give to kids. And that when you think about the system, right, supporting that child from peers to families to teachers to leaders to the community, all of a sudden you have that common language wherever you go.
Thank you, Mark. And we're actually going to be coming right back to you. So we have a question from Ayana Melvin in the chat, and this is for Dr. Brackett. Thank you so much for your presentation. What recommendations do you have around utilizing the OSTL field? That is strong here in RI for PD and support for our in-school educators around SEL. OSTL professionals are experts in SEL.
Yeah. Well, we're very grateful that we've had a grant from the Wallace Foundation to take all of ruler content and make it available for OST providers for free. So we've really spent the last 2 years doing the science and working with different OST providers from Connecticut to Tennessee to New York City, making culturally responsive lessons. And so, for example, our work on the emotional intelligence charter, which is about how you want to feel in your classroom, we've extended that to, okay, so here we are in this setting now. How do we want to feel after school? What are the things that we can do to ensure that everyone feels respect or valued or whatever the words might be? So those are available, and I'm happy to share that with anyone who's interested.
Thank you, Mark. So I know we're approaching time. I want to give folks who would like to ask any more questions the opportunity to raise their hand and jump in before we wrap up. And then I just want to elevate something that Hillary shared in the chat while we give folks that opportunity. So it says, Mark, the Providence After School Alliance is part of the Expand Ed SEL training, where we in 6 cities have been trained by your team to use the ruler, and we are running learning communities with a team of middle school educators and OST educators to share our SEL strategies. We are thrilled to see your training being offered to so many RI teachers. It would be great if we could do more sharing of the ruler work with both OST and formal ed systems.
Just one point about that. That course that I mentioned earlier is not limited to teachers in the old schoolhouse. So that course is available for free to every OST provider as well. So I'll make sure that you get that link, and please offer that, because we found great benefits for OST providers learning about emotion regulation, how to be culturally responsive and supporting children, in different settings and managing their feelings. So we'll make sure you get that.
Can I ask a question? For our differently able students, so I'm blessed with an autistic son, and I really feel that there's a lot of things that we can do, that we can put everything that we're talking about together, right? So he benefits obviously from the SEL. He likes to feel successful. We have to find ways that kids can feel successful. He's also bilingual. He prefers Spanish. And he's got a whole host of things, right? A child with autism is just a child with autism. He's got ADD, he's got a whole host of things. But how do we help a population that has been impacted so differently? Because I hear from parents every single day about the impact that's taken place with this population. So what are some of the things that you think that we really need to pay attention to? And I really see it as all the things that we're talking about, right? I mean, we have students that fall under all the categories that we really haven't paid as much attention to. So can we talk a little bit about our differently able students and how we can support them and the teachers that work with them?
Yeah, I think you're nominating, I think, what to me professionally and personally is attention, right? Because I think there is a real risk of compartmentalizing kids as subgroups, right? And I even use the language of that because of all the things that you just nominated, right? That we don't need to work at cross purposes, that one of the drivers of SEL is a student feeling successful. And part of feeling successful is having a strong foundation in academic and behavioral skills, right? From that's a great starting point, and that makes a kid feel successful. I think probably what you hear from parents, though, is so like on the one point, we don't want to compartmentalize. On the other, there are legal protections for students that are on IEPs. And I think parents are very protective of those things, right? And so it's moving away from, it's moving towards, an asset-based approach, but at the same time, acknowledging the benefits that students are legally allowed. I think one of the critical things that I've taken from this time is we've put a lot on parents. I would say that I think it's going to be really critical that every parent of a child that is differently abled has an ally in a school and feels like they have a point person that they can go to that is in their corner. And some of that we have in place. We have structures that allow that. We've got caseload managers, but it's not about the structure. It's about like what is that thing doing, and what is that person doing, and are they serving as an ally that's going to establish connections across kids and schools. There's more I can say, and I know we're at time, but I think you raise incredibly important points.
Thank you. So we are just about at time, so we have time for one more question. So I will turn it over to Senator Cano to provide our last question.
Thank you so much. I am very conscious of the time, and I just wanted to make sure I say thank you. These presentations have been very helpful and enlightening. One thing that I want to say is I was, I am still a multilingual learner, right? So I came here 20 years ago, and I came to high school from Colombia, and I found myself as an example to many of the kids probably, that there was an assumption made about me that because of my language skills, I didn't know how to do math well, right? So they put me in basic math level with that assumption, when reality was that in Colombia I was already doing geometry and calculus, right? So my point here is, how can we build the capacity with the staff and the mentors so when we can have a little bit of cultural competency, because we don't know what we don't know. And then so is there a way of building capacity where we have maybe a training of cultural competency so those biases doesn't get in the way of the student? And quite honest, the parents get frustrated at the same time because of the language barriers that might be the intervention that we need to do, but not so much that has to do with math or science and the level that the other students are at. So my question is, how can we build that capacity where we fit that cultural competency, maybe training? And I'm not sure if there's resources for that, and how can we go about it? So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Oh.
I'm happy to offer one thought just on that. So I think I would say do the training regarding cultural competency, right? But at the same time, couple it with the data, right? So the state has this powerful data to leverage to show, no, like our English learners, right? Our multilingual learners are performing at very different levels, right? There are, our kids are all over the map. And I think part of what we need to be doing is educating educators to see the diversity within the subgroup that you raised. So my husband is the exact story that you're talking about. I married a Brasileño, right? And he moved up to the States when he was in high school. And it's the same story, right? Thrown into basic level classes. That was not where he needed to be. And so I think it's equipping our educators, not just with the language around cultural competency, but also the data to put in front of them to say, here's the difference, right, within this group. And we need to look at the data to then be addressing the specific needs of our individual kiddos, not making assumptions about what they don't know.
I'll just jump in. Actually, my husband is from Panama, so it looks like we all got relatives from Central and South America. But I think one of the things that we do in our course, it's not the full course, but it's a big piece of the course, is make sure that educators understand the difference between people's inner experiences and their behavior. And oftentimes we misperceive behavior as being an indication of something that's going on that we know inside that child, when oftentimes it has nothing to do, with what's going on. And so there's a lot of deeper understanding that we can support educators on. I call it become an emotion scientist as opposed to an emotion judge, going through with that curious lens. Even in regard to bias, we know that we have, majority group biases when we're reading emotions of other people. And so being educated in those biases and understandings, I think, is one step toward, right, making a difference in terms of supporting children and academically and socially.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
Hey, Anna, I'm sorry. I asked the team to allow one more question because I stole a question, so I feel bad. So if anyone has one more question. Okay, no questions, fine. Then I don't feel guilty anymore.
All right. Thank you, everyone. That was a great conversation. Let me pull up our final slide with our next steps here. Hold on. Computer's a little slower than I'd like it to be. All right. So as a reminder, there will be pre-work again. You have to do your homework to get ready for our sessions. It just helps us all be organized and on par, ready to have these great conversations. We have noticed that we're running a little over each time and feeling like we want more time together. So we'll be extending the meeting by a half hour. We understand if that might not fit in everyone's schedules, but we wanted to allow for that. We'll also be adding an additional meeting on March 23rd. We're going to use a tool called Padlet. So you should get an email with an invitation to that Padlet where you can provide some feedback. And another little change for our next meeting on March 9th. If you notice on the first slide that Kelvin flashed to you, that meeting will be at 2 p.m. So I know that's a new time. So we want to make sure that you all saw that. But that was the time that our speaker would be available for us. So on March 9th, we will meet at 2 p.m. And of course, we have feedback loops that happen in between. So please join us. Feel free to also ask any questions at our email at leaptaskforce@ride.rhodeisland.gov. So we have plenty of opportunities in between sessions to allow for some collaboration and feedback. So please reach out to us if you're interested in any of that. And Commissioner, I don't know if you want to say a final goodbye.
Yes, so I want to thank all our presenters because it was pretty amazing session. And I want to thank all of you for your thoughtful questions. And we're going to keep moving forward and we're going to keep doing better as a state. That's the goal. The goal is that we work together in a very unified manner to make sure that we're doing right by all our kids, every single one of them, and that we change what we've been doing, right? It hasn't been working for everyone. So we just have to shift gears, and that's what we're doing, right? No more remedial. This is about acceleration. Thank you all.